They thought I was just a relic from the Excel era, but they forgot that all supply contracts from medical equipment to operating software bore my signature. When they kicked me out of that 8-figure deal, they didn't know I was the one holding the original copy of the exclusive vendor agreement, and I just revoked it. The next day, the entire supply chain ground to a halt. Contracts canceled, customers fleeing, and me, I was drinking coffee by the window, watching them beg to come back. The first thing you should know about me is that I don't like attention. I prefer to operate from the shadows, moving pieces across the board while others take the spotlight. That's why, for 10 years, I'd been perfectly content as supply chain director at Veritonic Solutions, building relationships with vendors and ensuring our biotech company never ran short of the specialized components we needed to maintain our edge in the market. My name is Erin McConnell. I'm 39, single by choice, and before last month, I'd never missed a delivery deadline in my entire professional career. My apartment in Portland overlooks the river, a view I rarely had time to enjoy because I was always working. My colleagues called me the wizard because I made problems disappear before they materialized. The CEO once joked that I had a crystal ball hidden in my desk drawer. "Erin, how do you do it?" He'd asked after I'd secured an emergency shipment of specialized polycarbonate filters during a global shortage. "I plan for disaster," I'd told him, "and I make friends, not just contracts." That philosophy had served me well until Trevor Hale arrived. Trevor was 33, with perfectly styled dark hair and the kind of confidence that comes from having never truly failed. He wore custom suits and spoke in MBA buzzwords. The board brought him in as our new CFO after our previous one retired. Trevor had made his name by slashing costs at startups before they were acquired, earning himself hefty bonuses in the process. From his first day, I knew we would clash. While reviewing my department's quarterly report, he circled several numbers in red. "These relationship management costs," he said, tapping his pen against the page. "What exactly are we getting for these?" I explained how the dinner meetings, occasional gifts, and personal touch had secured us priority status with key suppliers. How when global shortages hit, we were first in line for limited resources. Trevor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's very old school. Erin, in today's digital marketplace, we can optimize vendor relationships through analytics and competitive bidding. We don't need to wine and dine people to get results." That was the first crack in the foundation. I didn't know it then, but Trevor had already labeled me as a legacy employee, someone whose methods were outdated, who represented the old guard that needed to be modernized out of existence. For weeks, I noticed Trevor's digital fingerprints all over my department. He requested access to our vendor database, initiated audits of our procurement processes, and began scheduling meetings with my team without including me. Each time I confronted him, he had a perfectly reasonable explanation. "Just trying to understand the full ecosystem, Erin. No need to be territorial." Then came the merger announcement. Veritonics would be acquiring Novatech Biologics, a smaller competitor with complementary technology. The acquisition would double our size and require a complete restructuring of our supply chain. This was exactly the kind of complex integration I lived for, the chess game of merging two distinct supplier networks while maintaining operational continuity. I spent a weekend drafting a preliminary integration plan, analyzing vendor overlaps, identifying potential synergies, and flagging critical decision points. Monday morning, I arrived early to finalize my presentation for the executive team. My keycard didn't work. After 3 failed attempts, I called security. They escorted me to HR, where Marissa Winters, our newly appointed Human Resources Director, waited with a sympathetic smile that didn't match the coldness in her eyes. "Erin, there's been a realignment of responsibilities in light of the merger," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Trevor has been appointed integration lead, and he's implementing a more streamlined approach to vendor management." I opened the folder. Inside was a reassignment letter. I was being moved to an internal advisory role, effectively demoted to a position with no team, no budget, and no decision-making authority. "This is a lateral move," Marissa insisted, though we both knew it wasn't. Your institutional knowledge is valuable, but the board feels we need a more dynamic approach to the integration. Dynamic, the corporate euphemism for younger and cheaper. I've built this supply chain from the ground up, I said, keeping my voice steady. I've negotiated every major vendor contract we have, and we appreciate that history, Marissa replied, the practiced empathy in her voice making my skin crawl. That's why we want to keep you on as an advisor, but the merger requires fresh eyes. Fresh eyes, Trevor's eyes. I took the folder and left without another word. My new office, if you could call it that, was half the size of my previous one, tucked away in a corner of the building where visitors would never venture. My team had been informed of the change that morning. Most sent awkward emails expressing shock and promising to still seek my advice. A few brave souls stopped by in person, confusion evident on their faces. It doesn't make sense, said Kim, my procurement specialist of 5 years. You're the only one who understands how all the pieces fit together. I thanked her for her loyalty, but advised her to align with the new direction. No sense in her becoming collateral damage in whatever game Trevor was playing. For 2 weeks, I played the good soldier. I attended meetings when invited rarely, answered questions when asked occasionally, and watched as Trevor dismantled decade-long vendor relationships in favor of lower-cost alternatives with minimal track records. The crown jewel of our supply chain was our relationship with Lagira Corporation, a global leader in specialized biotech materials. I had personally negotiated our exclusive agreement with them 5 years earlier, securing preferential pricing and guaranteed supply of critical components that our competitors couldn't access. The agreement was complex, with multiple interdependencies and contingencies, the result of months of careful negotiation. The digital contract lived in our system, but the master agreement with all original signatures was in my personal files, including several addenda that weren't fully digitized in our contract management system. One Tuesday morning, I received a calendar invitation for a meeting with Trevor and the executive team. The subject, vendor strategy realignment. I arrived to find the conference room already full. Trevor stood at the head of the table, a PowerPoint presentation displayed on the screen behind him. Our CEO, David Matthews, nodded at me as I took the only remaining seat at the far end of the table. Glad you could join us, Aaron, Trevor said, his tone suggesting I was late when I was precisely on time. I was just explaining our new vendor consolidation strategy. The slide showed a chart comparing our current vendor network complex and interconnected with Trevor's proposed model, streamlined, with fewer suppliers and more concentrated purchasing power. By consolidating our purchasing and leveraging our increased scale post-merger, we can achieve approximately 22% savings across our supply chain, Trevor announced, clicking to the next slide. The cornerstone of this strategy is transitioning from our exclusive arrangement with Lagira to a multi-vendor approach using BioSource Global as our primary supplier, supplemented by 3 regional providers. I felt a cold shock run through me. Breaking our agreement with Lagira wasn't just bad business, it was potentially impossible. Trevor, I interrupted. Our agreement with Lagira is exclusive. We can't simply switch suppliers without significant penalties. Trevor smiled that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Yes, I've reviewed the agreement. There are exit clauses we can leverage, especially with the structural change from the merger. Legal has signed off on it. I doubted that. The Lagira agreement had specific provisions that survived any change in corporate structure. But before I could respond, Trevor continued. Furthermore, BioSource has offered us a signing incentive of 15% below market for the first year, with guaranteed pricing not to exceed a 3% annual increase for the following 4 years. This represents a significant improvement over our current terms. The executives around the table nodded approvingly. Cost savings always looked good on quarterly reports, even if they led to disaster down the road. The Lagira agreement has saved us millions during supply shortages. I pointed out, they prioritized our orders when others were waiting months. BioSource doesn't have that capacity. BioSource has significantly expanded their production capabilities. Trevor countered. Their new facility in Singapore is state-of-the-art. A facility that isn't even operational yet, I said. Trevor's smile tightened. It will be by the time we complete the transition. Aaron, I understand you've had a long relationship with Logira, but this decision has been made. We're moving forward with the new vendor strategy. David, our CEO, finally spoke up. Aaron, we appreciate your concerns, but the numbers Trevor has presented are compelling. The board has already approved the direction. I felt my face flush, but kept my expression neutral. And what about the exclusive nature of our current agreement, the penalties for early termination? As I said, Trevor replied, his patience visibly thinning. Legal has reviewed it. We have a pathway forward. I knew he was wrong, but I also knew this wasn't the forum to prove it. I stayed silent for the remainder of the meeting, watching as Trevor outlined the transition timeline, assigned responsibilities to members of what used to be my team, and effectively wrote me out of the equation entirely. As the meeting concluded, Trevor asked me to stay behind. Once we were alone, his demeanor changed. Aaron, I sense some resistance from you on this. I'm concerned about the risks, I replied evenly. Our agreement with Logira is more complex than I think you realize. Trevor leaned against the conference table, arms crossed. I've been brought in to modernize our approach. The old ways of doing business, the handshake deals. The personal relationships, they're inefficient. Data-driven decisions are the future. Some relationships can't be reduced to data points. Everything can be quantified. Aaron, that's business. He straightened, adjusting his cuffs. Look, I understand this is difficult. You've been doing things your way for a long time, but you need to get on board with the new direction. Or... The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Or what, Trevor? I asked quietly. He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. Or we'll need to discuss your future with the company more broadly. The advisory role was created to ease this transition, but it's not a permanent position. There it was, adapt or be eliminated. I nodded slowly. I understand perfectly. Good. He seemed relieved, mistaking my calm for acceptance. I'd like you to prepare a complete handover of all Logira relationship information to Marissa. She'll be taking point on the transition. Marissa, the same HR director who had delivered my demotion notice, was now being given vendor management responsibilities. The absurdity would have been comical if it weren't so destructive. Of course, I said. I'll prepare everything. That night, I sat in my apartment overlooking the river. A glass of Macallan 18 in hand, a gift from Logira's CEO after I helped them navigate a regulatory issue that had nothing to do with our contract. The lights of the city reflected on the water's surface, distorting and reforming with each gentle ripple. I opened my personal safe and removed a leather portfolio containing the original Logira agreement. Flipping through the pages, I found exactly what I remembered. Section 17.3, the exclusivity clause. The clause stated, in unambiguous terms, that Veritonics agreed not to contract with any direct competitor of Logira for the supply of specified materials for the 5-year term of the agreement. Any modification to this clause required the electronic signature of the original signatory from Veritonics Me, using the biometric verification system we'd implemented for high-security contracts. There was no merger exception, no easy exit, and most importantly, no way for Trevor to circumvent it without my direct involvement. I hadn't mentioned this particular clause in any meeting because, frankly, it had never been relevant. We had no intention of breaking the exclusivity when the agreement was signed. It was a concession we gladly made in exchange for preferential terms. Only someone looking to completely overhaul our vendor strategy would even encounter it as an obstacle. Someone like Trevor. I took another sip of scotch, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I had a choice to make. I could warn Trevor about the clause, help him navigate the contractual minefield he was so eagerly rushing into, and potentially save the company from significant legal exposure. Or I could let him discover it himself, when it was too late. The old Erin, the loyal company woman who had devoted a decade of her life to Veritonics, would have chosen the first option. But that Erin had been relegated to a corner office and told her methods were obsolete. I closed the portfolio and returned it to my safe. Then I opened my laptop and began drafting my response to Trevor's handover request, carefully omitting any mention of Section 17.3. The next morning, I delivered a comprehensive overview of our Lagira relationship to Marissa account history, contact information, purchasing patterns, everything except the one clause that would derail their entire plan. I included the contract management system reference number for the digital version of the agreement, knowing that the system only contained the standard terms, not the special addenda with the exclusivity clause. For the next week, I watched from the sidelines as Trevor and Marissa moved forward with their plan. They had video calls with BioSource executives. They drafted new purchasing agreements. They began the process of notifying Lagira of our intent to reduce our orders. I received an invitation to a courtesy meeting with the Lagira account team. Clearly, they wanted to understand why a valued customer was pulling back. I declined, citing my new advisory role, and suggested they speak directly with Marissa. 10 days after the strategy realignment meeting, Trevor signed the new agreement with BioSource. I knew because he made a show of it, inviting the executive team to a ceremonial signing in the main conference room. I wasn't invited, but I could see the celebration through the glass walls, champagne, handshakes, and self-congratulatory speeches about bold new directions. That afternoon, I received a call from Thomas Chen, Lagira's chief legal officer and a man I'd worked with since our partnership began. "Aaron," he said, his voice grave, "I've just received some disturbing information. Is Veritonics really contracting with BioSource?" I chose my words carefully. "The company is exploring new vendor relationships as part of the merger integration. You understand this would violate our exclusivity agreement?" "I'm aware of the terms, Thomas. Unfortunately, I'm no longer in a position to direct vendor strategy. I've been moved to an advisory role." A pause. "I see. That explains why my emails to you have been redirected to someone named Marissa Winters." "Yes, she's handling the transition." Another pause. Longer this time. "Aaron, we value our relationship with Veritonics with you, specifically. Before we take any formal action, I wanted to reach out directly. Is there anything that can be done to address this situation?" I glanced toward the conference room, where Trevor was still holding court, basking in his apparent victory. "I think this is a matter that will need to be addressed at the executive level. Thomas, I'm sorry I can't be more helpful." "I understand." His tone suggested he understood more than just my words. "We'll proceed accordingly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry to hear about your reassignment. Your professionalism has always been exemplary." "Thank you, Thomas. That means a lot." After hanging up, I sat at my desk, staring at the wall. The machinery was now in motion. Lagira would review the agreement, find the exclusivity violation, and initiate their response. The only question was how long it would take. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I arrived at work to find the office in chaos. People were rushing between departments, urgent meetings were being called, and a palpable sense of panic hung in the air. I stopped Kim as she hurried past my office. "What's happening?" I asked, though I had a good idea. Her eyes were wide. "Lagira has frozen all shipments and threatened legal action for breach of contract. They're claiming we violated some exclusivity agreement by signing with BioSource." I feigned surprise. "That sounds serious." "It's worse than serious," she said, lowering her voice. "We have a $17 million shipment of custom filters waiting to clear their facility. Without those, production at both Veritonics and the Novatech division will shut down within weeks." Trevor's been trying to reach their legal team since 6 a.m., but they're not responding. "I see," I said, keeping my expression neutral. "That's unfortunate." Kim gave me a searching look. "Did you know about this exclusivity clause?" I met her gaze steadily. "All contracts have their complexities, Kim." She nodded slowly, understanding what I wasn't saying. "Trevor's looking for you. Executive emergency meeting in 10 minutes. Thank you for letting me know." The executive conference room was a study in controlled panic when I arrived. Trevor stood at the head of the table, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, his perfect hair slightly disheveled for the first time since I'd met him. David Matthews sat beside him, face grim. The general counsel, Patricia Wang, was flipping through documents with increasing agitation. "Aaron," David said as I entered, "we have a situation." "So I've heard," I replied, taking a seat. "Something about Lagira and an exclusivity clause." Trevor's eyes narrowed slightly at my calm demeanor. "Lagira is claiming our agreement with Biosource violates our contract with them. They've suspended all shipments and are threatening to sue for breach of contract." I nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds consistent with the terms of our agreement." "What terms?" Trevor demanded. "The contract in our system doesn't have any exclusivity clause that would prevent us from working with other vendors." Patricia looked up from her documents. "There's a reference to Addendum C regarding exclusivity, but the addendum itself isn't attached to the digital file." "That's strange," I said mildly. "The complete agreement should be on file." Trevor's face was growing redder by the minute. "Well, it's not. And now we have a $17 million shipment held hostage and a potential lawsuit that could delay the entire merger integration." "That does sound problematic," I agreed. "Aaron," David interjected, his tone measured but urgent. "You negotiated the original agreement. What can you tell us about this exclusivity clause?" All eyes turned to me. This was the moment of truth: how much to reveal, how much to withhold. The agreement with Lagira includes a 5-year exclusivity provision for certain key components. I explained. Veritonics agreed not to contract with direct competitors, including Biosource, for those specific items. Trevor slammed his hand on the table. "And you didn't think to mention this during our strategy discussions?" I met his gaze coolly. "I raised concerns about the complexity of the Lagira agreement. I was told that legal had reviewed it and found a pathway forward." Patricia looked confused. "I never conducted a full review. Trevor told me it was a standard supply agreement with no unusual terms." Trevor's flush deepened. "Because that's what the contract in our system showed." "Is there any way to negotiate with Lagira?" David asked, trying to steer the conversation towards solutions. "Some compromise we can reach." "The agreement does have a modification clause," I said. "Any changes, including waiving the exclusivity requirement, would need to be approved by the original signatories using the biometric verification system." "Original signatories," David repeated. "Yes," I confirmed. "From Lagira, that would be their CEO, Michael Reed, from Veritonics." I let the sentence hang in the air. Understanding dawned on David's face. "You!" Trevor looked between us, the implications slowly becoming clear to him as well. "You're saying we need your authorization to modify the agreement." "That's correct," I said. "My biometric signature is required for any changes to the exclusivity terms." The room fell silent as the full picture emerged. They had sidelined me, stripped me of authority, and proceeded with a strategy that could only succeed with my cooperation they had done nothing to earn. "So," Trevor said, his voice tight with suppressed anger, "what will it take to get your signature?" I raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me. To modify the agreement, what do you want reinstatement to your previous position? A seat on the integration committee?" I studied him for a moment, marveling at his assumption that this was a negotiation, that I was using the situation as leverage. "Trevor, this isn't about what I want. This is about a legally binding agreement that Veritonics entered into with a valued partner. An agreement that you chose to violate without proper due diligence." "We don't have time for this," he snapped. "We need to resolve the Lagira situation immediately. The Biosource deal is signed. The board has approved the new direction." "Then you have a problem," I said simply. "Because Lagira has every right to enforce the exclusivity clause, and without my authorization, you cannot modify it." David leaned forward. "Aaron, surely there's a solution here. The company your company for 10 years is facing a significant crisis." I appreciated that he, at least, understood the value of appealing to my loyalty rather than making demands. But loyalty, I had learned, was a two-way street. "I'll need to review the situation carefully," I said, "including the full implications of the Biosource agreement and how it impacts our long-term supply stability. I cannot in good conscience authorize a modification that might damage Veritonics's operations. We don't have time for a full review, Trevor insisted. Every day that shipment remains on hold costs us hundreds of thousands in delayed production. Then perhaps you should have conducted a more thorough contract review before signing with BioSource, I suggested. Trevor looked like he might explode. David quickly intervened. Aaron, please, what would you need to feel comfortable moving forward? I pretended to consider the question. I would need to personally review all terms of the BioSource agreement, conduct a comparative analysis of supply guarantees versus the Lagira agreement, and develop a transition risk mitigation plan. Then, if I determine it's in the company's best interest, I would consider authorizing the modification. How long would that take? David asked. Given the complexity, at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. 3 weeks, Trevor exclaimed. We'll be in breach of our first deliverables to Novatech customers by then. Yes, I agreed. That is unfortunate timing. The meeting continued for another hour, with various alternatives proposed and dismissed. Could another executive override my signature requirement? No. The contract was explicit. Could we challenge the validity of the exclusivity clause in court? Not without risking an even longer supply disruption. Could we convince BioSource to delay our agreement? Not without significant penalties that would erase the supposed cost savings. Eventually, David asked for the room, leaving just him, Trevor, and me. Aaron, he began, I feel there's something more going on here. If you have concerns about your role or the direction of the company, let's address them directly. Before I could respond, Trevor cut in. Let's be clear about what's happening. Erin is using this contract situation to force her way back into a position of authority after being rightfully reassigned based on performance. I raised an eyebrow. Performance. My department has never missed a delivery target in 10 years. Our vendor satisfaction scores are the highest in the company. What performance issues are you referring to, exactly? Your methods are outdated, Trevor insisted. Relationship-based procurement instead of data-driven decisions. Exclusive agreements instead of competitive bidding. The company needs to modernize. And how is that modernization working out so far? Trevor, I asked quietly. 1 week into your new strategy, and we have a supply chain crisis that threatens the entire merger. David raised a hand to stop the escalating tension. Enough. This isn't productive, Aaron. Speaking frankly, what would resolve this situation from your perspective? I considered my answer carefully. I could demand reinstatement, a seat on the executive committee, Trevor's removal, but none of those things would undo the fundamental breach of trust that had occurred. I'll review the contracts and provide my authorization if it's truly in the best interest of the company, I said finally. But I'll need full autonomy to conduct that review, access to all relevant documents, and no interference from Trevor or his team. Trevor started to object, but David cut him off. Agreed. You'll have whatever you need. Please start immediately. I nodded and stood to leave. At the door, I paused and turned back. One more thing. I'd like to work from home during this review. My corner office isn't conducive to the concentration this requires. David nodded. Of course. As I walked out, I heard Trevor's controlled but angry voice. David, you can't seriously be giving in to this obvious. The door closed behind me, cutting off the rest of his protest. That afternoon, I gathered every document related to both the Lagira and BioSource agreements, copied them to my secure drive, and left the office. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time since Trevor's arrival, I was back in control, at least temporarily. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto my balcony overlooking the river. My phone rang, Thomas Chen from Lagira. Aaron, he said when I answered. I wanted to check if there's been any progress on resolving the exclusivity issue. The company is reassessing its options. I replied carefully. I've been asked to review the situation and provide recommendations. I see. There was a knowing quality to his voice. And may I ask in what capacity you're conducting this review? As the original signatory to our agreement, my authorization is required for any modifications. He chuckled softly. How convenient. For someone recently sidelined, you seem to have found yourself in quite a pivotal position. Sometimes corporate memory becomes most valuable precisely when it's been dismissed, I said. Indeed. He paused. Aaron, off the record, Legira values our relationship with you personally, not just with Veritonics. Your approach to partnership has been refreshing in an industry increasingly focused on short-term gains at the expense of stability. I appreciate that, Thomas. If your situation at Veritonics has changed, I would welcome a conversation about potential opportunities. Michael has always spoken highly of your strategic vision. Michael Reed, Legira's CEO, the other signatory on our agreement. That's very kind, I said. Let's resolve the current situation first, but I would be open to a conversation afterward. Excellent, I look forward to it. After hanging up, I sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas's offer had opened up possibilities I hadn't considered. I had been so focused on the immediate conflict with Trevor that I hadn't thought about the longer game. Over the next 3 days, I methodically reviewed both agreements, creating a detailed comparison that highlighted the significant risks in Trevor's strategy. The biosource terms, while offering initial cost savings, exposed Veritonics to substantial supply vulnerabilities. Their new Singapore facility was behind schedule. Their quality control metrics were concerning, and their capacity guarantees had so many conditions as to be practically meaningless. On the 4th day, Trevor called. How's the review coming? He asked, his attempt at a casual tone betrayed by the tension in his voice. It's comprehensive, I replied. I should have preliminary findings by early next week. Next week, his composure slipped. Aaron, we have customers threatening to cancel orders. The Novatech integration team is warning of massive disruptions. We need a resolution now. Quality analysis takes time. Trevor, isn't that what data-driven decision-making is all about? Complete information. I could almost hear him counting to 10 before responding. What if I told you the board is considering a special action to resolve this situation, including potential legal measures regarding your cooperation? I'm fully cooperating, I said calmly. I'm conducting exactly the review that was agreed upon with David. Any attempt to rush or circumvent that process would only raise questions about why such a thorough evaluation is being avoided. Silence on the line. He was realizing there were no good options, no way to force my hand without creating even more problems. The board meets tomorrow, he said finally. I hope you understand the seriousness of the situation for all involved. I do, Trevor, perhaps more than anyone. The next day, I received a calendar invitation, urgent resolution meeting, with the full executive team and board of directors. The message included a note that participation was mandatory and time-sensitive. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that projected both authority and composure. When I entered the boardroom, all conversations stopped. David nodded tersely. Trevor avoided eye contact entirely. The board members, most of whom I knew only passingly, watched me with curious expressions. Ms. McConnell, said Catherine Winters, the board chair. Thank you for joining us on short notice. We understand you're conducting a review of the vendor agreements at issue in our current supply disruption. That's correct, I confirmed, taking the only empty seat directly across from Trevor. And how is that review progressing? I've completed my comparative analysis, I said, placing a folder on the table. I'm prepared to share my findings. Catherine glanced at Trevor, who looked surprised. Clearly, he hadn't expected me to be ready with conclusions. Please proceed, she said. I opened the folder and distributed copies of my report to everyone present. My analysis identifies significant concerns with the biosource agreement that extend well beyond the immediate exclusivity conflict with Legira. For the next 30 minutes, I walked them methodically through my findings. Biosource's production capacity claims were overstated by approximately 40% based on their current facilities. Their new Singapore plant was at least 8 months behind schedule, according to industry reports, not the 2 months they had claimed. Their quality control failures over the past 3 years were concerning, with multiple FDA observations that hadn't been disclosed during negotiations. Most damning of all, their parent company had recently restructured debt in a way that suggested potential cash flow problems, hardly the stable supplier Trevor had promised. In contrast, I continued, turning to the Lagira section of the report. Our current agreement provides guaranteed capacity allocation even during shortages, quality metrics that exceed industry standards, and the flexibility to adjust volumes quarterly based on our needs. I closed the folder and looked directly at Catherine. My professional assessment is that terminating our exclusivity with Lagira in favor of Biosource represents an unacceptable risk to Veritonics's operations, particularly during the critical integration period with Novatech. The room was silent as the board members reviewed the data. Trevor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. These findings are selective, he finally said. Biosource provided documentation addressing many of these concerns during our due diligence. Documentation that I've included in Appendix B, I replied, along with independent verification that contradicts their claims. Catherine turned to Trevor. Did your team investigate these discrepancies? Trevor's confidence wavered visibly. We relied on the information provided by Biosource. As a publicly traded company, they have obligations to provide accurate data. So that's a no, Catherine said flatly. She turned back to me. Ms. McConnell, given your findings, what do you recommend? I recommend maintaining our exclusive relationship with Lagira for the critical components covered under our agreement, while exploring competitive options for non-exclusive categories. This approach balances cost efficiency with supply security. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. And if we were to proceed with this recommendation, would you provide the necessary authorization to resolve the current dispute with Lagira? I would, I confirmed, provided the terms of resolution are properly documented and approved by legal counsel. The board members exchanged glances. Catherine turned to the general counsel. Patricia, your assessment. Patricia, who had been carefully reviewing my report, looked up. Ms. McConnell's analysis is thorough and concerning. From a legal standpoint, maintaining the Lagira relationship while we investigate these issues further would be the prudent approach. Catherine nodded decisively. Then that's our path forward. Trevor, please prepare to notify Biosource that we'll be delaying implementation of our agreement pending further review. Ms. McConnell, please work with Patricia to draft the necessary documentation to resolve the dispute with Lagira immediately. Trevor looked like he'd been struck. But the cost savings are meaningless if we can't deliver products to customers. Catherine interrupted. This company was built on reliability, not just efficiency. We appear to have lost sight of that balance in this case. The meeting concluded shortly after, with clear action items assigned. As people filed out, David asked me to stay behind along with Catherine. Once we were alone, Catherine studied me with new interest. That was impressive work, especially under the circumstances. It raises questions about why your expertise was sidelined in the first place. I chose my words carefully. Organizational transitions often involve reassessing roles and approaches. Sometimes new leadership has different visions. Indeed. Catherine exchanged a glance with David. And sometimes those visions need recalibration based on real-world outcomes. David cleared his throat. Aaron, in light of recent events, we'd like to discuss your role going forward. The advisory position clearly doesn't leverage your capabilities appropriately. I'm open to that discussion, I said neutrally. We'd like to create a new position, Catherine explained. Chief Procurement Officer, reporting directly to the board on critical supply chain matters, particularly during the integration period. It was more than I had expected, a promotion rather than merely a reinstatement. That's a generous offer, I acknowledged. May I ask about the scope of authority? Full oversight of vendor strategy and relationships, David said quickly. Independent budget authority, a seat on the executive committee. And Trevor Catherine's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Hale's focus will be adjusted to financial operations, excluding procurement. You would operate as peers, with separate reporting lines. It was a diplomatic solution that allowed Trevor to save face while effectively removing him from my domain. Under normal circumstances, I would have jumped at the opportunity. But circumstances had changed. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. And I'm committed to resolving the current situation regardless. However, I'd like some time to consider the role before making a decision. They both looked surprised. Clearly, they had expected immediate acceptance. Of course, Catherine said. Take the weekend to think it over. We can finalize details on Monday. I thanked them and left, feeling their puzzled gazes follow me out the door. They couldn't understand my hesitation. How could I turn down such a vindication? But the truth was, something fundamental had shifted for me during this ordeal. That evening, I met Thomas Chen for dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking the waterfront. He arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed as always. You look well for someone in the midst of a corporate crisis, he observed as we were seated. The crisis is approaching resolution, I replied. I've authorized the necessary modifications to maintain our agreement with some added protections for both sides. He nodded approvingly. Michael will be pleased. He was quite concerned when he heard about the biosource situation. Concerned about losing a customer, or concerned about the precedent? Thomas smiled. Both, naturally, but also concerned about losing a valued colleague. Your reputation extends beyond Veritonics, Aaron. We ordered drinks, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. There was something liberating about sitting across from someone who valued expertise over politics, substance over style. I understand the board has offered you a new position, Thomas said casually. News traveled fast in our industry. Word gets around. It does. He sipped his martini. Have you accepted? I'm considering my options. He set his glass down carefully. Which brings us to the purpose of this dinner. Beyond celebrating the resolution of our contractual dispute. I thought as much. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Logera is creating a new division focused on integrated supply solutions for biotech clients, not just providing materials, but helping companies optimize their entire procurement ecosystem. Michael wants someone with both deep industry knowledge and a proven track record of strategic thinking to lead it. Someone like me, I said. Exactly like you. He smiled. Chief Operating Officer of Logera Life Sciences, reporting directly to Michael, with equity participation and board representation. It was a stunning offer bigger than the promotion Veritonics had dangled, with far more autonomy and potential. Why me, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because you understand that true supply chain excellence isn't just about cost metrics on a spreadsheet. It's about relationships, contingency planning, and strategic partnership. He paused. Everything that your current CFO seems determined to dismantle. I couldn't argue with that assessment. I'd need to consider the implications carefully, I said. There would be complications. Of course, take whatever time you need. Thomas slid a folder across the table. The formal offer is inside, along with some preliminary thoughts on the division structure. Michael is hoping you might be available to start within the next month. I opened the folder and scanned the first page. The compensation package was generous, significantly more than I was making at Veritonics, even with the proposed promotion. But it wasn't about the money, it was about respect, autonomy, and the chance to build something aligned with my values rather than constantly defending them. I'll have an answer for you by Monday, I promised. The weekend passed in a blur of careful consideration and planning. I reviewed both offers, made lists of pros and cons, and ultimately followed my instincts. Monday morning, I arrived at Veritonics earlier than usual and went directly to David's office. I've made my decision, I told him after declining his offer of coffee. I appreciate the opportunity, but I'll be leaving Veritonics. His face fell. Leaving Aaron, if there's something more we can offer. It's not about compensation or title, I assured him. It's about alignment of vision. The company is moving in a direction that doesn't match my approach to business. Because of Trevor, we can adjust reporting structures. I shook my head. It's more fundamental than that. The board approved his strategy despite obvious risks. That suggests a values misalignment that a new title won't fix. David looked genuinely regretful. Where will you go? I've accepted a position with another company. I didn't specify which one. He would find out soon enough. I see. He sighed heavily. I can't say I'm not disappointed. You've been a cornerstone of our operations for a decade. I'll ensure a smooth transition. I promised. The Lagira situation is resolved, and I'll document everything needed to maintain that relationship going forward. He nodded, resigned. 2 weeks' notice. I think that would be appropriate. News of my resignation spread quickly through the office. My team members stopped by throughout the day, expressing surprise and, in many cases, their own uncertainty about the company's direction. I assured them all that the supply chain would continue functioning, though perhaps with different priorities than before. Trevor avoided me entirely, which was fine by me. Our interactions had served their purpose, and there was nothing more to be said between us. The 2 weeks passed quickly. I documented processes, transitioned relationships, and prepared comprehensive handover notes. On my last day, the team organized a small gathering in the break room. There were heartfelt speeches, a cake with "The Wizard Will Be Missed" written in blue icing, and many promises to stay in touch. As I packed the last of my personal items, David stopped by my office. The board asked me to express their regret at your departure, he said. Catherine in particular mentioned that your analysis of the biosource situation has prompted a broader review of our vendor strategy. Better late than never, I replied, closing my box of belongings. Trevor has been reassigned to focus exclusively on financial reporting. Marissa will no longer have any procurement responsibilities. I nodded, appreciating the information but knowing it came too late to change my decision. Where are you going? He asked finally. If you don't mind my asking. I considered whether to tell him, weighing the professional courtesy against the strategic advantage of surprise. In the end, transparency seemed the cleaner exit. Lagira, I said. I'll be heading their new life sciences division as COO. His eyes widened slightly. I see. Well, that explains why they were so accommodating in resolving the contract dispute. The resolution was based on the merits. I corrected him. My new position was offered afterward. Of course. He didn't sound entirely convinced, but it didn't matter. Well, I wish you the best. Aaron, truly. Thank you, David. I hope Veritonics finds its balance again. 3 weeks later, I settled into my new office at Lagira's headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the executive suite hummed with purposeful energy. Michael Reed had welcomed me personally on my first day, introducing me to the team and outlining his vision for the new division. We're not just selling materials anymore, he had explained. We're offering security, continuity, and partnership. Who better to design that approach than someone who's been on the customer side for a decade? I had thrown myself into the work, developing strategies that balanced efficiency with resilience, cost with quality. My team, a mix of Lagira veterans and new hires from across the industry, brought diverse perspectives to each challenge. One morning, about a month into my new role, my assistant notified me that Thomas Chen was waiting to see me. Send him in, I said, closing the presentation I had been reviewing. Thomas entered with a smile, carrying a folder similar to the one that had contained my job offer. Good morning, Aaron. How are you settling in? Very well, thank you. The team is exceptional. They say the same about you. He placed the folder on my desk. I thought you might find this interesting. The quarterly bids for the Metropolitan Medical Center contract were just announced. I opened the folder to find a summary of the bidding results. Lagira had won the primary supply contract, with pricing that was competitive but not rock bottom, exactly the approach I had advocated. Congratulations, I said. This is a significant win. Indeed. and this part might be of particular interest. He pointed to the list of unsuccessful bidders. Near the bottom, Veritonics Novatech Biologics, with Biosource as their primary supplier. Their first major bid since the merger. Thomas noted, apparently, they couldn't match the quality guarantees or delivery timelines that the medical center required. I studied the document, feeling a complex mix of vindication and regret. The strategy I'd warned against had indeed proven problematic, just as I had predicted. Trevor Hale apparently presented the bid personally. Thomas added, quite unusual for a CFO to take such a direct role in procurement. Some lessons are learned the hard way, I said, closing the folder. Thomas smiled knowingly. Speaking of lessons, Michael asked me to invite you to join the executive dinner with the Metropolitan Medical Center team next week. He thinks it would be valuable for them to meet the architect of our new supply assurance program. I'd be happy to attend. After Thomas left, I walked to the window and gazed out at the city below. From this height, the river that I had watched from my apartment seemed smaller, just one element in a complex urban landscape. My perspective had shifted, literally and figuratively. My phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. David Matthews had endorsed me for strategic planning and vendor management. A small gesture of professional courtesy, perhaps tinged with regret. I returned to my desk and opened my calendar to block time for the upcoming dinner. My new email signature caught my eye. Aaron McConnell, Chief Operating Officer, Lugura Life Sciences Division. Below it, I'd added a personal motto, a reminder of the lesson that had brought me here. I am not the contract keeper, I am the contract. For 10 years, I had been the wizard behind the scenes at Veritonics, making problems disappear before they materialized. Now, I was building systems where such wizardry wouldn't be necessary, where relationships were valued as highly as metrics, where long-term stability wasn't sacrificed for short-term gains. Trevor had tried to cut me out of the deal, seeing me as an obsolete relic of an outdated approach. What he hadn't understood was that I wasn't just a signature on a piece of paper, I was the embodiment of the principles that made those agreements work. As I prepared for a meeting with my new team, I smiled at the irony. In trying to remove me from the equation, Trevor had actually freed me to create something better. Sometimes, the most powerful position isn't the one you're desperately clinging to, it's the one you haven't yet imagined.